Okay, this is Mark Souls, James Olney, and Jordan Bishop, and we are Group 8 in CS 364, and we are presenting the interviews elicitation. Dang it, I suck at this. Sorry, guys. Is that what it's really called? Interviews elicitation technique?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, just continue. I'll edit this part out.
Okay, sorry, guys. All right. We are Mark Souls, James Olney, and Jordan Bishop, and we are Group 8 of CS 364 at BYU, Idaho. And this presentation is on interviews elicitation technique. Next slide. An interview is a verbal exchange of information between two or more people for the sole purpose of one, gathering information from others. And interviews are separated into three major categories, and there's structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Basically, structured means that the questions all directly relate to the project, and so they're within that smaller scope, directly getting answers to the questions needed for our project. And unstructured that include tree. And lots of times, less structured interviews are more effective at the beginning of the process. So at the beginning of the project, when you're still looking for an understanding of the domain. So that way you can get to know the stakeholders better to lead into other techniques like surveys, questionnaires, and ethnographic shadowing. Next slide. So the best preparation for an interview is to prepare the questions that you're going to ask. If you Google interviews anywhere about any kind of topic, there's multiple resources everywhere that talk about the specific questions that you should ask. So if you're interviewing for a job, that question, sorry, it's my baby. I'll probably have to cut this out too. Just a second. So interviews are as effective as the questions that are asked. The more structured the questions are, the more useful information can be found. So you must both be listening to the informant's responses to understand what he's trying to say, and at the same time, you should also be thinking about your needs so you can make sure that your questions are answered within the limited time that you have to interview the stakeholders. So in conclusion, make sure that you have the best question that you can ask in exactly the perfect way so that you get the answer you need in the short amount of time that you have to interview the stakeholders. Next slide. So an effective interview can bring rich and detailed information directly from the stakeholders so that you know what they need. It can be an effective way to lead into lots of other techniques. Most times you might have a short interview, which could just be a query or an email asking for what you need to lead into questionnaires, surveys, or many of the other techniques. And also, you can get a holistic view of the whole system. Next slide.
So now I'll be going over the costs, the cons, and the disadvantages of our elicitation technique. There's a lot of planning and preparation that goes to an effective interview. And depending on the type of interview that you're going to be performing and the information that you hope to obtain, you can expect to prepare a lot of time, questions, targets, the location. There's a lot that goes into it. Through this preparation, it can take a long time. And basically, you're trading specificity in some regard for a broader spectrum of opinions. Some of the cons are that you might run into legalities, legal issues, remembering when you're starting out an interview. Things like informing the interviewee the purpose of the interview, if needed, obtaining parental consent if the person is under 18. If you're interviewing someone that provides confidential information, this may pose a risk to their information and to you spilling that information, so you've got to maintain confidentiality. And oftentimes interviews require someone who is trained, someone who knows how to carry out an effective interview. They must learn to not use leading questions, to use appropriate body language, and to leave their biases at the front door. Along with biases come influences of postmodernism, constructionism, feminism, etc., that can change the outcome of an interview and the information that you collect. Next slide, please. So continuing some of the disadvantages, while you think that an interview would be a very reliable source for the elicitation of data and information, there are a few pitfalls. A downside to interviewing is that there are biases, like we've mentioned, from the interviewer, and this can taint or contaminate the data. Another disadvantage is that they can be time consuming, like we mentioned earlier, and that can involve the preparations before and the preparations after, things like transcribing or analyzing the results. And those results are generally not generalizable. It's pretty specific. You can't take that across a broad spectrum. Our recommendations are to prepare thoroughly, to ask good questions, to prepare an atmosphere that's friendly and demonstrate good body language, make thorough and detailed notes of what is discussed, or find a way to record the information, thank the interviewee, and think about and meditate about what was discussed, and transcribe or store the information somehow. Appropriate uses of the interview elicitation technique can be when you need a lot of detail about the thoughts and behaviors of your subjects, when you want to provide context to some data or other situations, or when a participant of a group that is a focus group or a study group is uncomfortable speaking out and is more comfortable in a one-on-one situation. Next slide, please.
All right. So when my name is Mark Souls, and I was in charge of doing the data portion of the interview. So I actually physically went out and gathered interviews from 4 different individuals. The first individual that I interviewed, his name was Kevin Bateman. And each of the interviewees that I interviewed, I asked them 3 main questions. The first question being, what do you think a homework app should be, which is our project that we are working on. The second one is, have you ever used a homework app? And third one is, what did you like or not like about that app? Now, Kevin Bateman, he's 26 years old. He is a recent University of Utah graduate and majored in sports physiology and medicine and plans to go to med school. When I spoke with Kevin, he had used a homework app before, but several of them were lacking in simplicity and just a simple list of all of the homework assignments and announcements that are due. He said that he would like a homework app that can grab a list of assignments from whichever college or school he is attending and display them on a calendar. So this would require some implementation with the school that the individual will be attending, and then just a small description of the assignment and which class it is from and all that is necessary for that item. Next slide. Okay, the second person that I interviewed, his name was Angel Gonzalez. He was 20 years old and a freshman at BYU, Idaho, and is a software engineering major. And he plans to graduate and begin his career in software. And he had not actually used a homework app before. And generally, he just wanted something that would remind him when a homework assignment was due, or your announcements from his professor, tell him his grades, and allow him to make notes in the app itself. So generally, he wanted a fairly broad, simple app that would be easy to use. Next slide. The third person that I interviewed, his name is Andrew Vargas. He's 25 years old. He was a junior at BYU Idaho. He was a civil engineer and is hoping to graduate and go home to Oregon to find a job building bridges. He actually had experience with homework apps, and I believe he was using a homework app at the time. And he more specifically talked about a homework app that would have tools that was very specific to his major, specifically for his civil engineering, and would like to have an app that uses those tools. So it was very specific data, not necessarily for just a homework app, but for possible other apps. But basically, he wanted an app that would have equations and formulas and tutorials on how to do things. Next slide. Okay, the next is Ashley Seitz. She is 24 years old. She is an early childhood education major, sophomore at BYU Idaho, and wants to teach preschool part-time. She just wanted a very simple app, one that is easy to learn and to use. She has not used a homework app before, but she liked the idea of it and think that it would make organizing her assignments easier. But she wanted it to be very simple and not complicated to use, like many of the apps that she has tried to use in the past. Not homework apps, but just in general. The next slide. So overall, for my experience while I was doing the interviews, it was difficult to get information that was relevant to our homework app because we're very early in the design process and we needed a very broad amount of data, whereas interviews will give you a very detailed and a very specific set of information. It takes a long time to do and to set up an interview, so this was particularly difficult with the amount of time that we were given to do these interviews. And also, when I was doing the interview, it was difficult to extrapolate from the individual what kind of app that they actually wanted. They weren't really sure sometimes because they hadn't had any experience with any previous homework apps. So they gave based off of experience that they have had as a college student and using online resources. They just had to go off of that information. Another thing about the experience is that I found that it was very easy to introduce bias into the interview. I found that in the times that the interviewee didn't know what they wanted, it would have been very easy for me to ask them a very specific question to lead them on to get a certain answer. Also, there's selection bias and sampling bias, which the selection bias, if you notice, many of the people that I interviewed were around the same age and going to BYU Idaho, which may not be representative of all of our stakeholders. Next slide. In conclusion, it is important to know when to use interviews. They can give you very rich and detailed information, but we need to recognize when we need that detailed information versus a more broad information. We must also recognize that the person we are interviewing may not always give us the information we want, or they may feel uncomfortable giving this information. And as listed before, there are many difficulties in performing an interview. However, it does give very detailed information. Are time constraint, and you may only get a few interviews in, which may not be enough representation for your user base. So in this example, there was only 4 interviews, which in most cases you would have many, many more interviews if you wanted a more rounded and secure base of information. So that's our presentation.
Cool. Thanks, Mark.
I hope it was good enough.
Yeah. Do you guys have any idea how long that was? I don't know.
I think that was over 9 minutes.
Did you guys notice that our screen share was not like a presentation?
Yeah,
So like this is what I
it
think
was
it
just
should have been. So like
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Like it was like cutting off most of our, I don't know, like an eighth of the screen.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Because
Yeah.
it looked like you were just clicking each slide rather than actually presenting it.
Sorry, I don't understand. What do you mean? Part of it was showing?
Yeah, so on your screen you had it open, like, and so you could see all the list of slides, but it was in edit view instead of in presentation view. And so instead of filling the whole screen, it cut off parts of it so you couldn't see all the words. Do you know what I'm saying now?
Are you sharing what it looked like?
Yes. Oh no, I'm sharing what it should have looked like. I can show you what it did look like though if you want.
No, I'm fine.
So yeah.
Well, that should have probably been something we would have stopped for.
Yeah,